So I first met Amos and Sylvie Mommy, this young couple that you see standing behind my wife Laura and I, when Laura and I and some others had the awful responsibility to go and tell Amos that his father had been murdered while doing Ebola prevention work back in his home country of Guinea. And Moise was one of 8 people killed when the villagers heard a rumor that instead of helping them against the Ebola virus, they were actually bringing the Ebola virus into the village in order to exterminate them. Now, Moise Mommy was an amazing man who used all kinds of holistic ministries to open doors in a region that up until that time had very little access to the gospel. And so in addition to church planning and preaching and evangelism, he helped found what is known as Hope Clinic, a clinic run in the country of Guinea by the Alliance. And he directed another organization that provided wells and different types of community development and health education for people. And his son Amos came to our seminary, Fatiak, the West Africa Alliance Seminary in English, in Abidjan, with the goal of being prepared and going back and joining in his father's ministry to the Kono people. And so when news came of Moise's death, Amos and his wife Sylvie and their very newborn daughter had only been on our campus at the seminary for not even a week. And they had just made a very, very difficult and dangerous journey from their hometown in Conakry, Guinea, way up north and back down because our borders were closed because of the Ebola virus. So they made that multi-day journey. They were exhausted. They got to Abidjan, and at the bus station, somebody robbed them of all of their important papers, their passports, everything else. And when they got on campus, well, actually, they were not allowed to be on campus because we didn't know they were coming, and they had to get a certificate of health from the health department before we were allowed to allow them on campus because of where they came from. And when they got on campus, a lot of the students shunned them because they were afraid that they were bringing the Ebola virus with them. Only been there a few days, and we had to come and tell him that his father had been murdered. And a few months later, while they were trying to get over that shock, we got word that Sylvie's adopted father and mother also died of the Ebola virus back in their country of Guinea. Sylvie's father, or adopted father, was a doctor and had been treating people with the Ebola virus. He caught it himself, he didn't know it, and unfortunately gave it to his wife, and both of them passed away. All of that in the space of a few months. Can you imagine being just in your early 20s with a newborn baby and losing all of your parents? But yet, if you go to the seminary in Abidjan today, you will find Amos and Sylvie still on that campus, still studying. And I ask myself, when I look at them and I visit them in their apartment, why are they doing that? Why do they keep on? What motivates them to make the sacrifices that they have made in order to get the training? And I think one of the reasons is they understand what God is doing in the world today, and their heart's desire is to be a part of that. And they will do what it takes to be prepared to join God in what He's doing. Now, what you see here before you is a visual diagram of a course that I developed called The Big Picture. And Laura took the course and adapted it to teach in the Women's Academy at our seminary. They have to change it around because the women in this program have a lower level of education. Some of them come in not being able to read and write, so you have to adapt the courses to that. And so she took the course, adapted it, and this is her final exam. And she will show this to her students, and they have to tell her what's going on in this. So if you can look at this and tell me what's happening, you can get an A in her course. Anybody want to try? This is the story God's story, God's history, if you will. That is what the Bible is all about. It's a cohesive story that starts in Genesis, goes all the way to Revelation, with several overarching themes, one of which we will consider together this morning. And in this story, the peoples of the earth, with all their different cultures, all their different languages, all their different ethnic groupings, are the focus of what God is doing. For instance, in Cote d'Ivoire, where we have lived for 30 plus years, it's about the size of New Mexico, and it has over 100 different people groups in that little country. The entire continent of Africa, you have over 3,700 people groups. Every one of them represents a language, a culture, a worldview, and what God is doing in the beginning and the end of God's story revolves around His destiny for all these peoples of the world, including those in America and those in Africa. So as the story opens, God calls Abram, he wasn't Abraham at that time, he's just Abram, calls him to follow him, and he makes a covenant with him. And you see that covenant here in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. It records God's promise to Abraham that he will be blessed, that he himself will be a blessing, that all peoples on the earth will be blessed through him. So God's story involves every culture, every language, every ethnic group. From the beginning to the end of God's story, his desire, what he's doing, is to bless all the peoples of the earth. Now, maybe some of you are like me, and when you pick up a novel, you turn immediately to the back to see how it's all going to turn out. And then you read it and see how they develop the plot. I have that bad habit. And you can do that with God's story. You can pick up and look in the book of Revelation, those verses that we read this morning, where there's this vision John has, and he's at the throne of God, and he says, "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, every tribe, every people, every language, standing before the throne, before the Lamb." Of course, they were waving the palm branches, and they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." That's the end of the story. I want to be there. I want to be a part of that group around the throne, and I know you want to be there too. So God's desire from eternity past to eternity future is to bless the nations. And he has done that through various things that you find there in the scripture. And of course, with this story, as many stories, if not most stories, there is a key, or there is a hero, and we find that also in Scripture. In Luke chapter 2, amongst other places, you have this old man in the temple, Simeon. He's been told that he will see the Messiah before he dies, and Mary and Joseph bring the baby in to be dedicated on the 8th day after his birth. And Simeon says what he says, "For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared," where? In the sight of all nations. So, God promised Abraham that he would bless all nations through him. And Jesus came as Messiah to bring salvation to all nations. And all nations will be represented in worship around the eternal throne. God's heart desire, God's longing, if you will, is for all the nations of this earth to have access to the gospel message. And from the beginning to the end of God's story, we see this theme repeated. Let's look at a few examples this morning. Here's one of my favorite verses, Psalm 67, 1 through 3. "May God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine on us." We all love those verses, right? We all want to be blessed by God. But it goes on. You can't stop there. Why does God bless us? And it says, "So that your ways may be known on earth, your salvation among all nations. May the peoples praise you, God. May all the peoples praise you." The blessing comes to us so that we can bless others who can have access as well to God's salvation. Psalm 86, verse 9. All the nations, there again, there's that phrase, all the nations you have made will come and worship before you, Lord. They will bring glory to your name. And we get into the prophets. Prophet Isaiah, among others, refers to the coming Messiah, Jesus, in this manner. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. The nations. So you see this theme in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and we see it, for instance, here in Matthew chapter 24, where Matthew makes this observation. He's quoting Jesus now. He says that when the gospel has been preached to all the nations, then the end will come. So, what do we mean when we talk about the nations? When we look, for instance, at the nightly news, we get a picture of nations as being a place that is ruled by a certain government, a geopolitical entity, to use some big words, if you will. That's the nightly news view of the nations. And we look at the news online, we look at it on television, and people are going from one nation to another. There's wars protecting national borders. There's the problem of immigrants. Nations are all over the headlines in our world today, are they not? But when you look at the original languages in which the Bible was written, you find that this word nations actually has a different meaning, a very different sense. The words, as you see here in Greek, the key phrase is panta ta ethne. That's a translation of what is going on in Matthew chapter 28. And this word ethne gives us, or ethnos gives us our word ethnic. So when the Bible is talking about nations, it's not talking about geopolitical entity. It's talking about cultures. It's talking about ethnicities. So when Jesus says to his disciples in Matthew 28 to go to all the nations, he didn't mean simply go to every country. That's not what he's saying. He meant to go to every people group, every culture, every ethnic group, every language group. That's the good news view of the nations. And so we see the same concept repeated in Revelation again when it talks of the nations being around the throne of God. It's talking about people from every ethnic, language group, cultural group in the world today. So all of what God is doing, all the subplots of his story, whether it's what's taking place in Exodus or Noah's Ark or David's throne or crucifixion, the Pentecost, all of those fit into the big picture of what God is doing in the world today, fulfilling his promises to Abraham. That was many, many thousands of years ago. His promise was to bless all the nations through Abraham's descendants, so that every nation, every tribe, every people, every language will be represented around his throne, crying out in worship and adoration. That's the big picture. That's the truth that inspired Moise Mami to sacrifice his life for a people that had not yet heard God's story. And that's the story that challenges his son Amos to prepare himself to go back and take up his father's work. Amos takes very seriously God's command to make disciples of all people groups. And so he is working to be trained to be able to take gospel access to the Canaan people there in Guinea. So, that's the big picture. That's what God's doing in the world today. He is moving heaven and earth towards the goal that he has set. And that brings us to a question. If this is on God's heart, if this is what God is doing, what is my role in what he's doing? What about me? What about you? What is the role that we are called to play in God's story? Or, put it another way, what does it mean for us here in Canaan community to obey Jesus' command to take the gospel to all nations? When Jesus commanded his followers to go and make disciples of all nations, he brought them into the story. He put them in the big picture. And this command, which we know as the Great Commission, you know that, it's still active. It's still there. It's still a command. It's not a suggestion. It's a command. We're commanded to be a part of ensuring that all people groups, all cultures, all ethnic groups can hear the story so that they might have access to the gospel. And people often say to me, and what they say is very true, but they say, I don't need to go to Africa to be a missionary. I'm a missionary right here in my hometown where I live. People around me need to hear the story as well. And that's very true. That is very true. We are all called to be salt and light where God has put us. However, if that is all we do, then God's promises will never be fulfilled. There will still be many, many places in the world where people do not or will not have access to the gospel. They can't hear, they can't respond. So we need to look not only in our immediate surroundings, but to lift our eyes and look at the world and see what God is doing globally. So, let me give you an example. In the city of Wheaton, where we are living this year, Wheaton, Illinois, outside of Chicago, if you go to their church, their city webpage, they'll tell you it's about 55,000 people living there, and they list 36 churches. But the reality is, in this small city, small town, there are over 442 different congregations, Christians, that are there. You want access to the gospel in Wheaton, Illinois, walk down the block and there's a church. Television, internet, radio, bookstores, you name it, access is very, very easy to come by in Wheaton, Illinois, and in most of the U.S. Yes, that is the truth. You can have access very easy to the gospel here in the United States. We are blessed by God with that. But in our little country of Cote d'Ivoire, about the size of New Mexico, with about 24 to 26 million people in it, there are still over 6 million people who have little or no access to the gospel. If you were to go into a village and ask them, who is Jesus? They might say, oh, I heard that name once, but I'm not really sure who that is. Or they will tell you, they will look at you with a blank face and say, I have no idea who Jesus is. They do not have access to the gospel. Around the world, there are over just about 4,000 people groups that lack access to the good news of Jesus Christ. And they will never have access unless it comes to them from those of us outside their culture. Salimata Dembele, this young woman that you see here before you, was born into a Muslim family. She was part of a people group in Cote d'Ivoire that had, at that time, very little access to the gospel. But as a teenager, she was sent off to boarding school. She came in contact with Christian girls. They were talking and whatnot, and she wanted to know more, so someone gave her a New Testament, and with great fear and trembling, she read that. And in reading that, she dedicated her life to Jesus Christ, knowing that very, very possibly she would be ostracized, kicked out of her family for becoming a believer. But she did that anyway. And she has become a believer, and she has dedicated her life since then to creating access to the gospel in the Muslim north of Cote d'Ivoire. In this area, there are a lot of villages, even whole regions with very little access to the gospel. So Sally will go in, often with a team of women, and will sit down with the village church and negotiate with them, a village chief who's usually a Muslim, and she will offer to bring in educational supplies or offer medical clinics or programs in hygiene, nutritional training for mothers, those kinds of things, other services, if the chief of the village will give them permission to show the Jesus film in their own language in the village at night. Many, many times, these Muslims will accept that. And she has an opportunity to show the Gospel of Luke in living color in their language so that they can understand it. Many, many people have come to Christ because of the ministry that Sally has. She's currently finishing up a master's degree, her second, in community health at our seminary in Abidjan. And so she is a person on the inside who is continuing to use her skills to create access in the gospel, for the gospel where she is. So we come from the outside. We create access as international workers or missionaries. Sally, and people like her are reached by the gospel. They continue that work so that every people group on this earth will have an opportunity to hear the gospel in their own culture. And as people are reached through Sally's ministry, small groups of believers are formed, and they gradually grow, and eventually the National Alliance Church will send a pastor or missionary to work with them. Small churches planted, and so it goes, and access is created to the gospel. So that's internal access. Ongoing access to the gospel from inside a people group is crucial to what we do. That's one of the lessons of Pentecost, when everyone heard the gospel message in their own language. They all heard the wonders of God, and they responded, many thousands of them becoming believers that day. We're doing the same thing. It's a little slower. We don't get thousands every day, but we're doing a little bit and helping God to fill his promises to Abraham. So the big picture in Revelation, where every nation, tribe, people, and language are prostrate before the throne, in adoration, is what God is working towards, his goal for history. And the basic question is, how do we, where we are, help him to accomplish what he is doing? And so to that question, our part of the church, the Christian and Missionary Alliance, has given a bold response. You might know that the Alliance has been around as an organization for about 127 years. And in that time, by God's grace, we've been able to raise up networks of churches in many nations and people groups around the world. And the areas that you see here in blue are areas where there are strong networks of Christians that now exist. These places in blue have sustained internal access to the gospel, and you, as you can see, are blessed to live in one of those areas. And in other places that you see here in orange, the Alliance is still working alongside national churches to reach people groups within those countries that don't yet have access to the gospel. So what we have is today 52 countries where there are national alliance churches partnering together globally in what we call the Alliance World Fellowship. And of those 52, 22 of them are sending out their own missionaries. For instance, where I live in Cote d'Ivoire, I'm not assigned to work with the national church. I work in a regional ministry at the seminary. There are no alliance missionaries working with the national church because they don't need us. It's a church of 600,000 plus people, which makes it larger than the entire alliance church in the United States. They send out their own missionaries. They have pushing 50 missionaries now working in the country and in the surrounding countries in West Africa. So that bold response and the progress it has brought allows us to look into the future and focus on the places of the world where, at this point, there is no gospel access. And most of them are found in this triangle that you see here. You might have heard of the 1040 window. Well, that's where it is. That part of the globe contains the largest numbers of people groups that lack access to the gospel. And over 80% of the 700 plus alliance missionaries are working in this part of the world today. That's the Alliance's response to the challenge of the Great Commission of making access to the gospel. We can go on. In the world, the Alliance, with our limited resources, have chosen to focus on 7 different clusters of people groups that have some things in common. Maybe a similar language or culture or something like that. And we are basically working with 70 different people groups. And at Fatiak, the seminary where we have been teaching, we are training workers not only from the Alliance, but many other denominations as well, to go out, to go home, and help create access in their context for people who, up to that point, have no access to the gospel. So that's how the Alliance, the Christian and Missionary Alliance, is answering the basic question of creating access to the gospel for people who don't have it. But you have to answer that question for yourself. What can you do to help God fulfill his promises to Abraham, to fulfill his promise to bless all the people groups of the earth? Well, there are many things that you can do. For instance, you can go to this website. The Alliance has a very nice web page. Use this link, and there you will find a map of all the places that Alliance missionaries are working in the world, and get information and be able to pray for them, for the national workers, and for the people groups with whom they are working. Or you can write to this place, another web address, and they will give you monthly prayer updates every month about what is happening in the Alliance sphere of influence. And I have to tell you, as a missionary, that is the most important thing you can do. If you're not praying for the international workers out there, they might as well pack up and come home. Prayer is what sustains us. Prayer is what gives us the things that we need in order to accomplish what God wants us to accomplish. And if you're not praying here, then we pack up and we come home. But there's a lot more you can do. Praying is extremely important. And that's the first thing I would encourage you to do. But you can also be involved through what we call the Great Commission Fund. You know about that. You know about the pledge cards there. Laura and I served overseas in another culture for 30 plus years. And the reason that we were able to do that is because people prayed, people sent us, and people sustained us and gave us a monthly living allowance and provided for our field budgets and all those kinds of things. So because people are involved here on those levels of praying, of giving, of preparing and sending people, the work goes forward in other cultures around the world. That's what you can do. Or you can go to the next level and you can go yourself. In the Alliance today, you have many, many opportunities to go on short-term trips, a week, 2 weeks, a month, 3 months, a year, 2 years, many kinds of opportunities out there. If you think about the different things that missionaries do around the world, I guarantee you the Alliance is doing it somewhere in the world today. If it's mission aviation, if it's medical work, if it's disaster relief, church planning, evangelism, teaching, on and on and on, somewhere in the world the Alliance is doing it. And there's a very good chance that you could go and help them and be involved hands-on for a short period of time. So I would encourage you to look that out. Alliance then, the Alliance International Workers, missionaries are creating access from the outside by meeting needs, making friends, living among people groups, learning languages, people groups that don't have any access. And so we use all these kinds of things to do that. Preach, teach, medical work, disaster relief. We are there. Our goal is always to make disciples so that every people group will be represented around the throne of God on that last great day. So Laura and I came from the outside to create access, and we spent 30 plus years doing that. Much of that time equipping couples let me back up here, like this couple, Melanie and Musa Traore. They are now working from the inside to create sustainable access to people that didn't have access. Musa graduated from our seminary with a master's degree in translation, and he has gone to the western half of our country where there are many people groups, and he is translating the Word of God into a language that up to this point hasn't had it, and thus creating access to the gospel for these groups in their own language in a way that they can understand. So, sum it all up. God is on the move. God is working actively. We see prophecy, we see the scriptures being fulfilled right before our eyes every day in the world. The eternal story is unfolding right before our eyes. And we, little people that we are, have the great privilege of working hand in hand with God to accomplish what He is accomplishing in the world today. The great question for all of us is, what does God want me to do? What will be my chapter in God's story? How will you help to create access for people who still lack access? So Amos and Sylvie Mami, and Moise Mami, Salimata Dembele, Melanie and Musa Traore, these people, many of them from Fatiak, where we taught, have all given a bold response. They have given their lives to help God create access for all people groups on this earth. So what's going to be your response? How will your chapter in God's story be read?